The contract was already on the table when I walked in. One line, one signature, one sentence that turned my life into a locked room. Marry him, and my father's debt disappeared. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the pen. Across from me, Luca Moretti didn't move. He just watched me with that cold, unreadable calm people in my neighborhood called dangerous, and the newspapers called power. The room around him was silent in the way expensive rooms always are, like even the air knew better than to speak first. My father stood behind me, pale and desperate, telling me this was the only way to save our house, our name, what little we had left. I knew he was right. That was the worst part. Because I was 24, broke, and cornered by a debt I hadn't created, and Luca Moretti was the man who held the papers, the money, and the final word. He slid a black fountain pen toward me without a word. Not a threat, not a plea, just a choice wrapped in steel. Read it, he said quietly. I did. The agreement wasn't romantic. It was worse. It was precise, legal, permanent enough to feel like a sentence. I would live in his house, attend public events as his wife, keep the arrangement for 1 year. In return, my father's debt would vanish. No one would touch my family. No one would ask for more. I looked up at him, expecting arrogance, maybe satisfaction. Instead, I saw something else. Control, yes, but also restraint. He had the kind of face that made people imagine violence before kindness, yet he hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't cornered me physically. He hadn't touched me. That scared me more than shouting would have, because it meant he didn't need to. If I sign, I said, forcing the words past the knot in my throat, I'm not property. His eyes lifted, sharp and immediate. No, he said, you're not. The answer hit me harder than the contract. My father looked away. My chest tightened. For one impossible second, the room felt smaller, not because I was trapped, but because Luca had just acknowledged a line every other man in his world would have ignored. I signed. The pen made a soft scratch across the page, and with that sound, my old life ended. His driver was waiting downstairs. Not one car. 3 black SUVs lined the curb like a warning and a promise. Outside, the men in suits straightened the moment Luca stepped out, but when he motioned for them to wait, they did. Not because they liked it, because they obeyed. That was the first proof of who he was. The entire block shifted when he changed his mind. The second proof came when he opened the back door for me himself. No hand on my waist. No shove. Just a steady look that said he understood exactly how hard it was for me to get in. You don't have to thank me, he said as I hesitated. I'm not doing this for gratitude. Then why? I asked. He looked out the window for a moment before answering. Because debt should never swallow someone who didn't choose it. The words stayed with me all the way to his mansion, through the iron gates, past the marble hall, and the quiet staff who lowered their eyes as we passed. At the front door, he handed me a ring box. My fingers went cold. Wear it tonight, he said. At dinner, everyone will understand your place. I should have been angry. I was. But underneath the fear, something else moved. A thin, dangerous thread of trust one didn't want to feel. Then he added, softer, and your safety. I opened the box. The ring wasn't flashy. It was simple, heavy, real. I stared at it, then at him. You expect me to believe this is protection? His jaw tightened once, like he'd heard the challenge and accepted it. No, he said. I expect you to decide whether you want protection from the man the city fears, or mercy from the men who already ruined your life. The words landed like a door locking. I understood then that signing the contract wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of danger, one with rules, witnesses, and a man who could destroy me or shield me with the same hand. And for the first time, I realized the monster I'd been afraid of might be the only person in the room who would keep his promise. The ring sat cold in my palm for a second before I slid it onto my finger. It fit like a fact, not a promise. He watched me do it without moving, one hand still resting on the back of the chair, his expression carved into that same controlled stillness that made other people back away. I hated that my pulse jumped anyway. Not because he was gentle, because he wasn't. He was careful, and in his world, care looked more dangerous than threats. A soft knock came at the door, and one of his men opened it only enough to speak. There had been a breach at one of the side entrances. Someone had tried to photograph the room. My stomach tightened, and before I could ask who, he was already looking at me. You stay here, he said. I stood up at the same time. No, The word came out sharper than I meant. He didn't like that, but he didn't punish it either. That was the first thing that unsettled me. I'm not asking you to obey blindly, he said, his voice low. I'm asking you to let me control the part of this city that wants to use you. And if I want to see for myself? I asked. Then you walk beside me, he said, after a beat. Not ahead, not behind, beside me. The hallway outside was quieter than I expected, polished stone swallowing every sound except the muted steps of his men behind us. He kept his distance, but not because he was indifferent. He positioned himself between me and every open doorway, every shadow, every stranger who looked too long. At the end of the corridor, a woman in a tailored coat turned too quickly when she saw him and nearly dropped her phone. She recognized him. Everyone did. Her eyes flicked to my hand, to the ring, then back to his face, and I saw the instant judgment before she masked it. That was the world he lived in. Not just fear, expectation, ownership, power. And suddenly, I understood the cost of the ring in a way I hadn't in the room. It wasn't only protection. It was a target. He saw me realize it. His jaw flexed once. If this is too much, don't, I cut in. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Don't hand me an exit just because you know how heavy this is. For the first time, something in his face shifted. Not surprise. Respect. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then his hand moved. Not to touch me, but to guide the door open wider so I could step through first. I noticed the detail because it mattered. He was used to commanding rooms. This time, he let me enter on my own terms. Inside the private sitting room, a folder waited on the table. He didn't hand it to me. He set it down and backed away half a step, giving me space to choose. The papers inside were not romantic, not flattering, not kind. A legal agreement, a security protocol, a list of boundaries written with brutal clarity, where I could go, who I could call, what I could refuse, what his men could not do without my consent. It was the kind of document a man like him would never need to offer if he only wanted control. My throat tightened, and I looked up at him. You made this for me. I made it so you could say no and still be safe, he said. The answer should not have affected me. It did, because no one had ever built me a cage with an exit before. I reached for the pen, then stopped when I saw the final line. Any violation voids the protection. So if I leave? I asked. His eyes held mine. Then you leave with my word intact. The answer sat between us like a fragile thing. I signed. Not because I was giving him my trust all at once, but because for the first time, the choice was mine and the risk was his too. His men would now be accountable to my refusal. He would be responsible for keeping a promise in a city that ate promises alive. When I set the pen down, he exhaled once, quietly, like a man taking on a weight he had planned to carry alone. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and whatever he saw changed the air in the room. What? I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was flatter than before. Someone used your name at one of my properties. My skin went cold. Not because he sounded angry, because he sounded like a man already moving toward the problem, and this time, my choice had tied me directly to the consequences. He looked at me, not as a possession, not as a guest, but as a responsibility he had accepted in full. Come with me, he said. If you still want to decide things for yourself, you should hear this before anyone else decides it for you. We arrived at one of his properties 10 minutes later, the kind of place that looked quiet from the outside and commanded fear from the inside. No flashing lights. No shouting. Just two guards at the entrance who straightened the moment they saw him and looked at me like they were trying to decide what I meant to him. He didn't touch me. He just walked beside me, one hand open at his side, giving me the choice to keep up or fall behind. That mattered more than I wanted to admit. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polish and expensive coffee, but the air was wrong. Too still. Too careful. A receptionist stood behind the desk with a pale face and a clipboard shaking in her hand. They said your name, she told him quietly. They said she had permission. My stomach tightened. I hadn't given anyone permission for anything. He turned to me once, not asking if I was sure, just checking whether I could stand what came next. Then he led me into a private office where a folder waited on the desk, already opened. Inside was a forged access request with my name on it, my birthday wrong by one digit, and a signature close enough to be insulting. He didn't explode. He read it twice, then set it down like evidence, not drama. That was the difference between power and panic. "Who saw this?" he asked. The manager answered from the doorway, sweating through his collar. "Only the night shift. We stopped it before it spread." He nodded once, then looked at me again. I realized he was measuring something I hadn't asked him to see, whether I would fold under being used or stand under being blamed. My hands were cold, but I kept them still. "This is mine," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. Not mine as in possession. Mine as in my name, my boundary, my life. He heard the difference. I saw it in his face. The room changed. Not softer, sharper. He took the folder, closed it, and handed it to the manager. "No more access without my direct approval," he said. "No more names. No more assumptions." Then, to me, "And from now on, if anyone uses you to reach me, they answer to me first." It was not a declaration of ownership. It was something heavier. Protection with rules. Respect with consequences. My throat tightened anyway, because being believed that quickly felt almost like being seen. Almost. But the cost arrived with it. He reached for his phone, made one short call, and within seconds the property's security chief was standing in the office. Not to remove me, to ask me questions. Calm ones. Practical ones. Where I had been before the call. Whether anyone had approached me. Whether I had noticed anything strange. He was turning my discomfort into procedure, my fear into a pattern they could defend against. That should have made me feel safer. It did. And it also made me understand how much responsibility had just moved onto my shoulders. If I stayed close to him, I would no longer be invisible. If I walked away, I would be walking away from the first real line of defense anyone had ever built around my name. I hated that the choice felt like a gift and a warning at the same time. When the security chief left, he stayed near the desk instead of coming closer. "You handled that better than most of my men," he said quietly. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement, and somehow that was more intimate. I looked down at the folder in his hand, then back at him. "So what happens now?" He held my gaze for one long beat, as if deciding how much truth I could carry. "Now," he said, "I stop treating your decision like a pause in my day and start treating it like part of the risk." He paused, jaw tight. "Which means if someone is willing to use your name, then they already know you matter." Outside the office, a voice rose in the hallway, sharp, urgent, offended. One of his men. He went still. So did I. Then he opened the door, and I heard the next problem before I saw it. Someone from inside his circle had come with a complaint, and my name was already caught in it. His hand hovered at the frame, not blocking me, not protecting me from the truth, just giving me the choice to hear it. "Stay here," he said. Then, after a beat, softer. "Or come with me and see who just made the mistake of involving you." He didn't move first. Neither did I. The voice in the hallway sharpened into a complaint about the folder, about the names inside it, about what it meant that my name was written beside his. His men were already reading it as a problem. I could feel it before I saw it, the old rule of his world settling over the air like smoke. If you stood too close to him, people assumed you had either power or prey written on your face. He looked at me once, not with the cold certainty he gave everyone else, but with a quiet warning that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't a private office anymore. This was a test. And if I walked out with him, I would not be walking back into my old life unchanged. "You heard him," I said, more to myself than to the room. My voice came out steadier than I felt. His eyes lifted at that, almost surprised. "Then let's see what they're really saying." For a second, the edge of his mouth shifted like he was trying not to smile. Not because it was funny, because I had just stepped closer to the kind of risk he lived with every day, and I hadn't asked him to carry it for me. He opened the door wider. The hallway was colder than the office, bright with white light, and too many silent men in dark suits. One of them stood near the far wall with a hard face and a paper in his hand. He stopped talking the moment he saw me. "She doesn't belong in this room," he said, looking past me at him. "Not if the file is what I think it is." The words hit before I could prepare for them. Not belong. Not here. Not with him. The old shame tried to rise, but I swallowed it down and held my ground. He didn't answer right away. That was worse somehow. He was choosing his words carefully because mine mattered now. "She belongs wherever I decide she's protected," he said at last, calm and dangerous. "And if you have a problem with that, you can say it to me directly." The man's jaw tightened. I felt the whole corridor wait for the outcome. But then he did something I hadn't expected. He looked at me, not the others, and held out the folder. "Read the last page," he said quietly. If you're going to be inside this with me, you get the truth too. My fingers touched the paper and my pulse jumped. It wasn't a demand. It was trust. Real trust. The kind that made the air feel heavier because it could be broken. I looked down, and there it was, my name, not as a warning, but as part of a decision that had already been made by people with more power than I had ever asked for. My throat tightened. This world had rules I didn't know, debts I hadn't caused, consequences I couldn't pretend away. But he was not shielding me from that truth. He was letting me stand in it. And that was when I understood the cost of being seen by him. It wasn't just danger. It was responsibility. It was being asked to carry my own weight in a world that would rather turn me into an excuse. I lifted my head and met his eyes again. If I stay, I said, I'm not staying as something you hide. The room went still. He didn't look away. Good, he said. Because I don't need you hidden. His voice lowered, rougher now. I need you here, where they can see exactly who you are. The words landed harder than any promise. Outside the office, someone called his name once, urgent, impatient, waiting for him to choose the next move. He didn't move yet. He waited for mine. And for the first time since I'd met him, I didn't feel like I was being pulled into his world. I felt like I was stepping into it on purpose. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. Then I'll read everything, I said. And I'll stay for the part that hurts. His gaze dropped for one brief second, like the answer had cost him more than he wanted to show. Then he nodded once, slow and final. Not approval. Commitment. Behind us, the door stayed open. In front of us, the hallway of his world waited to decide what I was worth. I took one breath, then another, and walked out beside him. The hallway felt narrower than it had a minute ago, like the building itself was listening. He walked beside me, not ahead of me, and that small choice changed everything. Two men in black suits straightened when we passed. No one stopped him. No one even tried. But when one of them glanced at the folder in my hand, I felt the whole weight of what I'd just agreed to settle against my ribs. His hand brushed the small of my back once, not possessive, not showy, just enough to guide me through the noise waiting at the end of the corridor. I knew then that being seen here was not the same as being protected. It meant being counted, measured, made visible to people who could use that against both of us. At the end of the hall, the room was already full. Low voices, glass on wood, a map spread across the table with red marks I didn't need explained to understand. He stopped before the doorway and looked at me, really looked. The kind of look that asked for nothing and still took your breath. Then he opened the door wider and let me step in first. That was the moment it hit me. Not that he wanted me near him. I'd known that. Not that he was willing to protect me. I'd felt that in every locked door and guarded street. It was that he was risking the one thing he never risked for anyone, control. He was making space for me inside the part of his life where every mistake had a body count, and he was doing it without armor, without performance, without a backup plan. The folder in my hands suddenly felt heavier. Not because of what was inside it, but because of what it represented now. A choice he had already made, and was letting me make too. I sat down only when he did, because the room was watching for which of us would blink first. Across the table, one of the men said my name like it was a question. My throat tightened, but I kept my face still. He didn't answer for me. He waited. That waiting was louder than any command. The papers slid toward me, and I saw my own future in the clean edges of them. Signatures, schedules, addresses, numbers that meant protection and exposure in the same breath. I had thought staying would mean surrendering my life to his world. Midway through the first page, I understood it meant something harder. It meant becoming part of the responsibility that held his world together. Not a prize, not a secret, a witness, a liability, a reason. When I looked up, he was already watching me, his jaw set as if he expected me to run. But I didn't, because I finally understood what he had been saying all along in the only language he trusted. If he was letting me stand here, then I was no longer something he could afford to lose. And if I accepted that, I couldn't keep pretending his danger was separate from my choice. My chest hurt with it. Then he spoke once, calm and final, and the room went quiet. She stays. No one argued. Not because they were afraid of him, though they were. Because the way he said it turned me from collateral into consequence. The realization landed all at once. He had not brought me here to place me behind him. He had brought me here to put me at his side, where every decision would have my name in it. My eyes burned, but I didn't look away. I reached for the pen. Not because I was giving in, because I was stepping in. And when my signature dried on the page, I knew there would be no going back to being someone he could protect from a distance. From this point on, anything done to him would touch me too. Anything I chose would carry his name with it. He took the folder from my hand carefully, like it mattered that I had handed it over myself. Then, for the first time, he removed his ring and placed it in my palm, not as a claim, but as a promise I would have to decide whether to keep. His fingers closed around mine for one brief second. Enough to say he understood the cost. Enough to make the next step impossible to undo. And when the door opened again, the people outside were no longer waiting to see whether I belonged to his world. They were waiting to see what I would do with it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark with his ring in my hand and felt the weight of it like a second pulse. By morning, the city had already decided who I was supposed to be. His men stood outside the apartment door. Not to guard me, to remind me. I could hear them shifting in the hall, low voices, polished shoes, the soft click of radios. Every sound told me the same thing. The moment I signed, I stopped being a visitor in his world and became part of its accounting. He was waiting in the study when I walked in. No suit jacket, no performance, just tired eyes, rolled up sleeves, and a folder spread open beside a cup of coffee gone cold. He didn't ask if I had changed my mind. He looked at my face and knew I had already made one choice too many for fear to still control me. "There's a meeting tonight," he said quietly. "If you come with me, they'll treat you like leverage." I laughed once, because that was the problem. I was already leverage. My name on his paper, my presence in his house, my silence in his war. I reached for the folder, but he put his hand over it first. "You can still walk away before this becomes official." His voice was calm, but the room wasn't. Every man outside, every camera in the hall, every rule his enemies had already started writing around us. None of it would forgive a woman who stepped too close to him and then tried to leave unmarked. I looked at the ring again. It wasn't jewelry anymore. It was a line, a promise, a target. "If I leave now," I said, "they'll use it to break you." Something moved in his face then. Not anger. Worse, relief that hurt. Because he knew I was right, and because he hated that the right choice was the one that cost the most. He reached into the folder and slid out a document I hadn't seen before, my name on one side, his on the other, and a clause that made my stomach tighten. Protection, control of assets, emergency authority, a legal cage dressed up like safety. "Sign it," he said, but softer this time. "And I can protect you publicly. Refuse, and I protect you anyway, but I do it blind." That was the new cruelty of loving a man like him. Even his mercy had consequences. If I signed, I gave him access to my life in every room. If I didn't, I became the weak point everyone could reach. I took the pen. My hand shook once, then steadied. I signed my name where his world asked for it, and the sound of the pen lifting felt louder than a gunshot. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. For one brief second, he looked at me like he wanted to thank me and apologize at the same time. Then his phone rang. One of his men answered it in the hall, and the color drained from the room before I even heard the words. "They moved early," he said, already standing. "Your brother's company. They're freezing the accounts." I stared at him. "They can do that. Not if we act now." There it was. The point of no return, not in the signing, but in the word itself. Before today, I could still pretend his life and mine ran side by side. After today, every attack on him would come through me, and every defense he made would cost me something I could not get back. He handed me the ring. I closed my fingers around it and followed him to the door, where the men outside stepped aside like they were witnessing a funeral and a coronation at the same time. When I crossed that threshold, I knew one thing with terrible clarity. I had not been claimed. I had chosen the price of staying. I had imagined the worst part would be the signing. I was wrong. The worst part was the silence after, when the ring was already on my finger and the room had started treating me like a decision that could not be taken back. His men moved around the penthouse with the kind of efficiency that made fear look polite. Laptops opened. Phones lit up. One of them set a folder on the table between us, thick with names, numbers, and the kind of damage a family could do when it decided to get creative. "The accounts are already being frozen," he said quietly. "If we don't stop it tonight, the board will use the scandal to force a takeover." I looked at the pages, then at him. Every instinct I had screamed to ask how bad it could get. But I already knew. Bad enough to ruin the company. Bad enough to turn my brother into collateral. Bad enough to make my name a weapon in someone else's war. He didn't touch me. That was how I knew he was trying not to control this. He stood behind the chair, one hand braced on the back, jaw locked so hard I could see the muscle flex beneath his skin. If I move openly, he said, they'll say I used you to build leverage. If I do nothing, they'll take everything you've ever had. So what do we do? My voice shook once, then steadied. He looked at me for a long beat, and in that look was the first real fear I had ever seen on him. Not fear of losing power. Fear of asking me to pay for it. You decide, he said. The room went still. Even the men by the door stopped pretending not to listen. I had never felt smaller than I did in that second, and never more seen. Because he was handing me the one thing he had never handed anyone. The right to choose whether his world could touch mine. My brother would hate this. He would call it surrender. But surrender wasn't what it felt like. It felt like truth. It felt like a man who could force 1,000 outcomes, choosing the one that left room for my voice. I swallowed hard and stared at the file again. If I called my brother first, he might still think this was a negotiation. If I waited, the board would move faster and everything he had built would start collapsing before dawn. There was no clean answer. Only a price. I reached for my phone. My hand trembled so badly I missed the screen once. When I finally pressed call, the sound seemed louder than the city outside. He didn't stop me. He only watched, and in that stillness I understood the cost of being loved by a man like him. He would rather lose control than lose me to a decision made without my consent. My brother answered on the third ring, angry and exhausted and already suspicious. I told him the truth. Not all of it. Just enough to keep him from making the wrong move. Enough to give him a chance to stand down before the accounts were sealed and the lawyers finished carving the family apart. When I hung up, my whole body felt hollow. But the board had paused. For now, there was air. For now, the fall had not come. I turned back toward him, and he was looking at me like I had just crossed a battlefield and come back with my hands empty on purpose. You could have let me handle it, he said. I know, and you still chose this. I nodded once. Because if I let you carry everything, then I'm not loving you. I'm just letting you disappear. Something broke open in his face then. Not weakness. Recognition. He crossed the space between us and stopped with one hand hovering near my cheek, not touching until I leaned into it myself. The gesture was so small it almost hurt. Then stay, he said, and his voice was raw now, stripped of command. Not because I asked. Because you want to. For one fragile second, I believed we had made it through the worst of it. The ring on my finger felt warm. The room felt possible. Then his phone lit up again. One message. No name. Just a photo. My brother leaving the building with security behind him, and beneath it a line of text that made my blood turn cold. They've decided to make her choice public. The screen slipped from his hand as he looked at me, and I knew before he spoke that the next move would cost us something we could never get back. I didn't remember standing up. I only remember the room tilting as his phone hit the carpet, and the screen kept glowing with my brother's face leaving the building, like the universe had chosen the cruelest possible way to force our hands. He looked at me once, and there was no command in him now. Only decision. Stay here, he said, already reaching for his coat. No, I answered, grabbing his wrist before he could move. The ring caught the light between us. The same ring that had once felt like a trap now felt like a vow. If they want my choice public, then they get it from me. Not from fear. Not from him. He stared at me like he was hearing my name for the first time. I had seen him destroy rooms with a glance. I had seen men lower their eyes before he even spoke. But in that moment, he didn't look powerful. He looked responsible. Like power was finally becoming a burden he intended to carry correctly. He didn't argue. He handed me his phone. One silent offer. My fingers shook as I called my brother. It rang twice. Then he answered, breathless, scared, angry, all at once. I closed my eyes, pressed the phone to my ear, and said the only true thing left. I chose this. I chose him. And if you walk away now, you stop making me the reason for everything that's broken in this family. There was a long silence. Then my brother's voice cracked. You really love him? I looked at the man beside me. The man who had first entered my life as danger, then as shelter, then as the one person who never once asked me to become smaller so he could feel larger. Yes, I whispered. But that's not the important part anymore. Because the important part was what he did next. He took the phone from my hand, and with the same calm that could have ordered a city to kneel, he told my brother where to meet us, what men to bring, and what rules would not be broken. No threats, no games, no blood, just terms, just boundaries, just enough control to protect the truth without crushing it. That was the moment I understood the title in a way I never had before. He had not made me his wife by taking my freedom. He had become the kind of man who could stand beside my freedom without trying to own it. When we reached the building lobby, my brother was waiting under the cold white lights, looking older than I remembered, smaller than I feared. For one awful second, nobody moved. Then he saw the ring. Then he saw my face. Then he saw that I was not asking for rescue. I was asking for room to live with my choice. He exhaled like surrender hurt him. "If this is what you want," he said, "then I'll hate it less if I know you chose it." My chest broke open. I crossed the distance first. Not my brother. Not him. Me. I put my hand over my brother's and felt the last piece of my old life tremble, then settle. "I did choose it," I said. "And I still choose you too. That's what hurts. That's what makes it real." Behind me, I felt him step closer, not to claim, not to interrupt, but to stand where a promise should stand. For the first time, the city didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place where I could keep my love without surrendering myself. And still, as our hands stayed linked in the lobby light, I knew the hardest question was not whether I would stay. It was whether we could build a life out of a truth that had already cost us so much. He met my eyes, and in them I saw the only cliff left. Not danger, but trust. "Tell me where you want to go from here," he said quietly, "and I'll follow that." The lobby stayed quiet after that. Not empty. Quiet. The kind that comes after a storm when the city is still listening to itself. I could still feel his hand under mine, steady and warm, but I did not cling to it. I let the silence breathe. That was new for me. I used to fill every gap with apology, with fear, with the need to be chosen before I disappeared. Tonight, I stayed where I was and let myself be seen. He looked at me like he understood that difference. He did not step in front of me. He stepped beside me. "Whatever you decide next," he said, his voice low, "it will be yours." The words should have sounded small. They did not. They landed harder than any promise he had ever made because they cost him something. I knew that. I knew how much it had taken for a man like him to stand back and leave the door open. Outside, one of his men waited by the curb with the car running. Inside, my brother was still there, no longer an interruption, no longer a threat, just a witness to a life that would never be the same. I turned to him first. "I'm not asking you to understand everything," I said. "I'm asking you to respect my choice." His jaw tightened, then eased. He nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was better. It was acceptance without ownership. When I looked back at him, the man who had once used power like a wall, he was already taking off the ring he had kept on his hand for too long. Not because he was losing me, because he had finally understood I was never something to keep. He held it out, palm open, and I saw the future of that small piece of metal change in his hand. Not a claim, not a chain, a memory. "I'm not asking you to wear anything," he said. "I'm asking you to take only what you want from me." My throat tightened so fast it hurt. I took the ring, not to put it on. I closed my fingers around it and felt the cold edge press into my skin, a final reminder of everything we had survived and everything we could not undo. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the black key card he had given me on the night this whole life began. I placed it in his hand. It was small. It was simple. It felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. "Keep the door," I whispered. "I'll decide when I come back." He closed his hand around the card, but he did not try to hold mine. That was the part that changed everything. My brother watched me take one step toward the elevator, then another, and I did not turn back to check if anyone was following. For the first time, I was the one leading the way out of the room. At the glass doors, I stopped and looked at the city lights spilling over the wet pavement. In the reflection, I saw him behind me, still and quiet, not as the man who had first made me afraid, but as the man who had learned how to wait. I lifted my hand once, not in goodbye, not in surrender, just in answer. Then I walked into the night with his ring in my pocket, my own name in my mouth, and the old fear finally left standing behind the glass.